Hi, my name's Jacob Barrett, and I work with the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. This is the Postscript, a new podcast where we extend the conversations that begin in our public lectures. The idea behind the Postscript is simple. When the lectures end, the questions don't. There are always stories behind the scholarship, personal stakes, and broader implications that don't quite fit into a formal talk. This series is a space to return to those moments, to reflect, to ask about what comes after, and to think together about why this work matters. Each episode features a conversation with a scholar who's visited the center recently to give a public lecture. Rather than just revisiting the content of their talk, we're going to step back and ask broader questions about their work, their methods, and the larger field of evangelical studies, including how their work intersects with lived experience, public discourse, and community life. I am especially excited to be launching the Postscript with our very first guest, Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Beth is a professor of history at Baylor University and the author of Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Beth recently delivered a lecture at uccs that you can find on our YouTube channel, and her work has been foundational in shaping contemporary conversations about gender, power, and authority within evangelical institutions. In our conversation, we talk about the origins of the project, what it means to recover women's history from the archive, how Beth understands the deeply personal responses her work often provokes, and how she navigates doing public-facing scholarship in a moment where public scholarship can be so important but so costly. I couldn't imagine a more thoughtful or generous scholar to help us begin this project. So thanks for being here, and welcome to the Postscript. Thank you so much for being here today and chatting with me.
Oh, it's so good to be here and talk with you.
I'm just finished watching your lecture that you gave at the center a couple months back, and it was just so wonderful. I'm excited to dive in a little deeper about some things about you and your work and
Yeah.
um, kind of get some more context for the talk. But I want to start by stepping back from the book itself that you spoke on, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. What was the moment or series of moments that sparked that
Yeah.
project? Where did it come from for you?
No, that's a really good question. So after the Making a Biblical Womanhood, I honestly I didn't want to write any more trade press books. I was sort of like, yeah, that was enough. I think I just want to fade into the background. And and I talked with a good friend, and he was like, Beth, you should never feel pressured to write anything. But at the same time, you have an opportunity here. If there is anything else you left unsaid, or that you think you want to say, you have a chance to say it. And I was like, that's actually a really good point that I have an opportunity here that I never expected. And so I sort of chewed on that for a while. And I was teaching a graduate seminar that semester. And one of the readings for the class was one of my Baylor colleagues, a woman named Elizabeth Flowers, who she has a book coming out on complementarianism, which might be something that y'all are interested in at the center. But she wrote a book in gosh, it's not all that long ago, but it's sometime in the mid, 2010, 2012-ish, but on Southern Baptist women and power in the post-World War II era. And it's called Into the Pulpit, which is a great title. And in it, we were reading it for class, and I came to the section where she talks about the women who were fighting on the front lines against women's ordination in the 70s. And I suddenly realized that the primary voices fighting against women's ordination were pastors' wives. And that struck me because I was like, what is going on here where we have the loudest voices against women in ministry, the voices of women in ministry?
Mhm.
And since I am a pastor's wife myself, I was intrigued. I was like, I want to know. I want to know what the story is here. And in some ways, I sort of grew up, I think, thinking that there were always pastors' wives. And as I thought about that as a historian, I realized that that probably is not the whole story. And so that's where this book was born.
And I think it's so interesting that you're doing this work from the lens of a historian. Um, and, am I right in knowing that your training wasn't necessarily in like US
Evangelicalism?
history and evangelicalism?
No,
Yeah.
no, no. I mean, it's kind of the thing with, it's one of the, I guess, adages of being in the historical profession is that everybody who's in European and global history ends up taking classes in American history, whether they
Sure.
want to or not, whereas Americanists hardly ever take classes
Yeah.
beyond them. And so even though my training is in medieval history, my sort of broad-based training was in women's history. And that was across the spectrum from the ancient world all the way up to the modern world. And in fact, I remember while I was taking a course on essentially on women. And I think it was just a basic women's history, women's studies course. And it was at the same time, I was at North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I was taking that course at the same time that Dorothy Patterson was fighting on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention, not very far, I mean, within North Carolina, um, against women in ministry. And so that was going on at the same time that I was in grad school, and we were having those conversations in my women's studies class.
And I think, as a trained historian, you have, developed significant archival skills.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
one of the things that you just kind of mentioned it in passing in your talk, but I wanted to follow up on was the archival work that went into this book and
Yeah.
what being in the archives for you looks like. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
think the other piece, as kind of like a historian of women's history, sometimes going through the archive and telling these marginal stories or telling these stories that like the archive seeks to erase or to silence. I wanted to
Yeah.
think about what that looks like as you're going through and kind of trying to tell these histories.
Absolutely. So, as a medieval historian, the only way I can do my research is going to European archives. And, I don't know how much your audience knows. When we hear the word archive, I don't know what they imagine in their head.
Yeah, yeah.
But in some ways, it's like it's a library. And it can either be a large library like the British Library, or it can be like a cathedral library, or it can be a local public records office, kind of like what you go down to get your marriage license or to get your birth certificate today. Except for these public records office contain public records going all the way back through the medieval world. In fact, as far back as often that area has evidence for. And so in some ways, what I usually do when I go to these archives, I usually look through their lists ahead of time to see what records they have available. And I either pull a bunch of manuscripts, which sometimes come in boxes that you just open up and they're full. Sometimes they're medieval scrolls that you have to have somebody come out and unroll for you before you can look at them. And sometimes they're actually bound books. They're medieval bound books. Some of them are rebound, like in the 16th and the 17th century. And sometimes there are a whole bunch of medieval manuscripts that some Victorianists decided to put all together in one big manuscript. And so you have like this miscellany of like weird things all throughout it. So that's often what I'm doing when I am in the medieval archives. And as a medievalist, I tell people this that we don't have as many sources as the modern world has. So we have to look in weird places to find like evidence of social and religious history. So, for
Mhm.
example, as an Americanist, if I want to know what's going on in 20th century American religious history, in some ways, I can read newspapers, I can read magazines about, religious magazines. I can listen to audio recordings of
Mhm.
sermons that are all over the place. For the medieval world, if I want to know what's going on religiously, yeah, I have sermons. I work on sermons. I might have some people's voices. But those voices are usually contained like in court records, or they're contained in like in where we have records of heresy trials,
Mhm.
Inquisition records. And some of them are even contained in economic records. So like I'll go to see how much people are giving to the church or when they're giving money to the church and that sort of thing. And so you kind of have to go all around to kind of help piece your story together. And I took those skills as a medievalist, having to look in not as readily available places
Yeah.
to my work with evangelical history. And in fact, when I was in the Southern Baptist Archives in Nashville, I requested a couple of boxes, some on the clergy tax file returns, and some on, some. And I remember the archivist told me, she was like, no one's ever requested these before. And which, kind of boggled my mind. But then I thought
Yeah.
about it and I'm like, but there's probably people who would look at these would be economic historians, and they're not coming to the Southern Baptist Archives. So I think it gave me an angle on this topic as a medievalist that many modern historians don't look at it the same way. And so I
Yeah.
think that was, and that also allows you to find voices that aren't readily available. Like, for example, I tell the story of a woman in the 8th chapter of Becoming the Pastor's Wife, who I didn't even know her story in the archives. I ran across a reference to her husband and a concerning document about her husband. And that led me to track down, to actually go to Canada, to track down this story, to try to find, as I said, because I'm looking, you know, as a medievalist, I know that even if the story's hard to find, I can probably piece together some pieces of it. And so
Mhm.
I went after those small pieces. And in that, I found the story of a woman who probably would have remained buried to history if I hadn't followed that trail.
When it's so interesting to have that lens as a medievalist with, to be comfortable looking at tax records or court proceedings
Yeah,
or, places that like you said, the contemporary historian might not go to because there's such a plethora of other resources to look at.
absolutely. I mean, it's not a criticism. It's just
Right.
simply a different way of looking. And that's why we need historians trained in all sorts of different fields because we look at history from a different perspective, each one of us, and together we can pull that story together.
One of the things that I thought was really powerful about your talk and about the book, is that obviously the book is about, this figure of the pastor's wife.
Yeah.
Um, and you're presenting a lot of interesting histories about how this figure comes to be. And I'm wondering, I think something that's interesting about the work that the center does is kind of bridging scholarly
Yeah.
conversations with community conversations. And so I wonder what you see as maybe the most misunderstood dimension of that figure of the pastor's wife, maybe from
Oh,
both spaces of scholarly conversation about, pastors' wives and from within the evangelical communities.
absolutely. So I think both communities dismiss her. I
Mm,
think from the academic perspective, in fact, even, I still remember when I first started writing this book and said I was going to do this, one of my colleagues suggested it was like, you know what, probably more people would pay attention to this book if you wrote it from the lens of the pastor. And I was like, I can't even believe you said that. I
right,
was like, I can't believe you even said that. But I mean, in some ways, that is somewhat true. That people are like, oh, the pastor's wife, like, what is this? This is a sort of a silly figure who, bakes a lot of cookies
right,
and goes to, dresses and nice clothes and runs maybe women's ministries. And while she is important in certain circles, she's not really seen as pivotal to the story of evangelicalism and actually even more pivotal throughout church history. And so what I found is that, in fact, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that we can't really understand what has happened within the evangelical world. I mean, a big question. I remember my advisor asking me this question a long time ago, and it was, why do women believe? Why do
mm,
women in conservative spaces believe that their God given role is to be subordinate? And that's in some ways you can say, well, it's because they've been taught that's what the Bible is. They've been taught about inerrancy. They've been taught these things and they want to be good Christian women. Some of it, I'm a little more cynical. Some of it is like, well, in order to get ahead in conservative spaces as a woman, you have to play the game.
Hmm.
And so the women who play by the rules get more book deals and get more power and get to maybe
Yeah.
use their gifts in ways that, they may not consciously be doing that, but women who play by the rules get elevated within conservative spaces. And so I think that, there was just an article in Religion News Service that came out and said about women who are going to bat to defend women's subordinate status. And I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, it was looking at Allie Beth Stuckey. And I was like, yep, look how much power she has gained by doing this.
Yeah.
And that is simply, that is part of the story. But, I think another reason, and this is the part that I think people miss, is the reason women believe that they are supposed to follow in this very particular mold to be a good Christian wife is because of the model that's given to them. And that model is the pastor's wife. And, we think about the evangelical world as a world of discipleship. And the pastor's wife serves as the primary disciple, whether she wants to or not,
Hmm.
discipler for the other women in the church. That's why her role is so critical. That's why it's really important that the pastor's wife toe the line. Because if she doesn't toe the line, if she doesn't follow the theology that's in the church, she can cause chaos for the leadership
Hmm.
because other women look to her as a leader and they follow her. And so the way you get women to follow this model of biblical womanhood is by giving them this leader and teaching women to be this leader where their whole identity is invested in this role. And then they turn around to invest that identity in other women. And so it's evangelicalism discipleship. And not very many people have seen that critical piece the pastor's wife plays.
That she's not just even kind of like a parallel sense. I was thinking a lot about it. Like sometimes the pastor's wife gets called like the first lady of the church,
Yeah,
or,
yeah,
that it's,
yeah.
and
Hmm.
so, drawing the comparison to like the first lady of the United States, or, like heads of states' spouses. But even
Absolutely.
more so than that, like they serve like a very, I think those parallels actually erase the significant like work that those women do.
Yeah. Oh, I think so too. I mean, on the one hand, there are a lot of parallels. But I remember one woman, her name, I think it was Marilyn. Oh gosh, what was her last name? But she wrote a book, which let me see, I'm trying to think when it was. Um, it's Marilyn Odin. And I think her book was on the early side of these types of pastor's wife books. And she wrote it in 1967. And one of the things that she remarked in it, she said, look, at the end, in some ways, the pastor's wife is a lot like the doctor's wife, is a lot like the politician's wife, is a lot like the lawyer's wife or professor's wife. But she said, but when hubby gets the degree, you're not called to do surgery with him.
Right.
And when hubby gets the degree in the pastor's wife story, the wife is called to serve in that job alongside him. And that makes the role really distinctive.
One of the moments that struck me as really interesting that I wanted to talk to you about came at the very end of the Q&A, um,
Yeah.
when, the final question, this gentleman came up and asked a question that was very personal, and,
Hmm.
he was moved to tears. And so there it was a very, emotional, personal moment, which I think is different from how we see maybe most scholarship
Yeah.
striking people, or most scholarly
Yeah.
conversations or Q&As happening after a academic talk. And so I wanted to talk to you about that. Like, um, how do you understand your work as something that kind of sits maybe between those spaces of like scholarly
Hmm.
intervention and, personal or pastoral impact? Like, what for you does like inhabiting both of those roles kind of
Yeah.
simultaneously mean, and how do you navigate that?
Absolutely. It is certainly something unique for a scholar to be in this space where the work that we do is so personal. And also that, I remember talking with Kristen Dumais one time, and she's like, our work changes lives. It changes
Yeah.
people's lives. And so I think about like my work with the making of biblical womanhood and becoming the pastor's wife. I not a week goes by that I don't get a letter from someone around, in the US, around the world, or something, just writing and saying thank you. And that it, really opened their eyes and some women return to their calling. Some women, I mean, it's just amazing that's the stories that come out. And it's a challenging space to be in some ways because as an academic, we're not trained for this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's actually where it comes in that I am a pastor's wife. And so I have spent as long in my pastor's wife career, if I can call it that, has paralleled my academic career. And so I have always walked this line of working with hurting people while at the same time being a professor in the classroom. And so I think in some ways I'm prepared for it maybe more so than some folk are for this
Sure.
type of thing. But at the same time, that also makes it a little bit dangerous because, people will often ask me for advice. They want to know if they should leave their church. They want to know, and I have to be really careful because I'm not a trained counselor. I don't know the personal circumstances of those stories. I don't know. So usually what I just do is I try to listen and to let them know that they are not alone. And I think that's the most important thing. And I think that's really what my work does is that
Yeah.
it helps people see that they've never been alone. And that is um, that can be powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it's something about, I think there's always a little bit of that in religious studies spaces or people um, working in religious studies classrooms. I think about my work, I research religious freedom in the US, and
Yeah.
I'm often telling my students, I'm not like when we're reading through this case or we're talking about this case, my job isn't necessarily to be a legal expert and tell you how the court should have ruled or what mistakes the court
Right.
made, but to look at what happened and think about um, what other structures or things had to be in place for that to make sense. Um,
Yes.
but the students come to class often with personal questions or
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so I guess there to some extent it's something that people working on religion are familiar with, but I think it struck me as such a visible moment, and maybe because of your experience as a pastor's wife, how seamlessly you stepped into that role of seeing this man needing
Well,
some
yeah.
reassurance and doing that while also still being the scholar and saying, here's some academic critique that we can sit with. It
Yeah.
just was really important.
Absolutely. And the classroom does prepare you for this. I mean, I think everyone in the classroom, our students bring personal stories, and you have to figure out how to navigate those in the classroom space. So, yeah, that's also good training.
Kind of related, I wanted to think about your thoughts on public scholarship and the
Oh,
importance of
yeah.
doing public
Yeah,
facing
yeah.
scholarship. You said like Dr. Dumais had told you that your work is changing lives, and I think that's true. I've seen so many people read kind of this work on evangelicalism and have it change their worldview or have it start
Yeah.
shaping how they're considering the things in the way that they show up in their lives or the different institutions that they belong to. So there's such an important need for public facing scholarship. And at the same time, I think right now it's such a scary time to be a public facing person, especially with critiques of kind of conservative Christianity or of the
Yeah.
Christian right or of the political right. So I'm wondering what, I guess, just your thoughts on navigating public scholarship and
Yeah.
the risks and rewards of doing that.
Yeah, I do think it's really important. I think it's really important that academics, more and more academics, step into this space in one way or the other, because we have the skills. We have the skills to help make sense of our world, and I think it's in some ways it's a responsibility for us to share that to as broad of an audience as possible when we are given a platform and the ability to do it. But I also think that there are significant risks to doing it as well. And I told someone not too long ago that I'm not sure if I will ever recover from the trauma of the Making a Biblical Womanhood, my first book,
Sure.
because I was not prepared for the onslaught afterwards of being in that public scholarship space and in the middle of a really horrible, a space where male pastoral figures do not treat women well, especially women who threaten their power. And women whose power is also threatened in that space do not,
Yeah.
or are forced to step in to critique other women, because that's, the men in those spaces always like to put forward women to critique other women. You see that all the time. And so I don't think I was prepared for the social media onslaught. And so I think I've gained a lot of wisdom, and I've learned how to draw a lot of boundaries since that time. And one of the things that I've learned, is that you don't have to respond to people.
Yeah.
You don't have to. It just because somebody steps out and decides to critique you, they can say whatever they want. You know what? And you don't have any obligation to respond. And that is something that I felt at the beginning, that anytime somebody critiqued me or attacked or anything like that, that it was my responsibility to speak out. And that's simply not true. I don't, my work speaks for itself.
Hmm.
My writing speaks for itself. And I'm confident in the writing that I've put out there. And in fact, as time has gone on, um, the things that I was more speculative about in the writings in both books, have been confirmed. Where I would be like, yeah, I was 100% right on that. And so I just don't, you don't have to respond to people. Just, I think somebody made me a mug along somewhere along the way, that said, oh, what does it say? It was this really great saying: I am not obligated to give anyone my unpaid time.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
not, that's not my job. I don't have to do that. And so now, it's a choice. If I choose to respond, I can do it on my own terms.
Hmm.
That's something that I've really found, is I can do it on my own terms. And if I choose to step back and not get involved, that's fine. You know, and I mean, I had some scholars who were like, you were like, well, it's your responsibility to step out and answer. And I was like, actually, it's not. It's like reviews. People write book reviews all the time. And I remember my advisor telling me that she never responded to reviews. And
Yeah.
I was like, I understand the sort of the wisdom in that, because it's like, let the people can say whatever they want and have the conversation, and you don't have to be involved in it. So I think that's something that's really helped me, is that I choose. I don't have to be out there. I don't owe anyone my private time, and I don't owe anyone information that I don't want to give.
Yeah.
And so those it took me a couple of years to learn those lessons, but now I feel very confident in standing. And in fact, my interaction after becoming the pastor's wife was very different than my
Mhm.
interaction after the Making a Biblical Womanhood. And I'm much happier
Good.
and much more at peace than I was in the aftermath of the Making a Biblical Womanhood.
I think that's great advice for period. I think that's great advice for anyone on social media, whether they're doing
Yeah,
scholarship or not. But I think particularly for as it becomes more and more important for more academics to be doing public facing work and doing public scholarship, that I think that's really, really sound wisdom to share. So thank you. The opposite side of that
sure.
would be, I guess if everyone in the social media sphere, if people are always asking you questions or saying things that maybe you don't want to talk about or you don't want to
Yeah.
address or you don't want to give space to. The other side of that, in kind of a playful note, what is a question about your work that you don't get asked that you wish someone would? Like, is there something that you always are kind of, it doesn't fit in the talk and you hope it comes up in the Q&A, but you don't get the
Oh,
chance to
yeah.
talk about it?
So, I mean, there's always so many different. In my in the becoming the pastor's wife, one of my favorite sections, actually, which I don't know if anyone has ever asked me about in a public talk, and it's a section where the I'm talking about the clerical involvement in sort of how how changes in clerical status is connected to the rise of the pastor's wife role in the post-Reformation world. And in it, I tell this story about they're called the geese of Crossbones Graveyard.
Mm.
And it's essentially a house of prostitution in the medieval world that is owned by a bishop. And it's this really amazing story because it's alive and well today. You can actually go to the graveyard. It's probably not the actual grave it's reputed to be, but it's on land near where this brothel, the stews of London, were located. It's over, if you go to London, it's over on the south side, by where Shakespeare,
Mm.
where the Globe Theater is, and so it's over in that area. And you can actually pass, if you're walking by down from the theater down the Thames, you actually pass the bishop's house that owned this property that was once this area of prostitution. And so it's this really incredible story about how women, on the one hand, were their behavior was seen as sinful, was seen as outside the church. They weren't allowed to be buried in the graveyard, yet they are actually being employed by the bishop who's profiting literally from
Mm.
their sex labor. And many of their clients are actually the clergy.
Mm.
And so it's just really, and I think that story has parallels with things we see going on in the church today.
Sure.
And so it really surprises me that I haven't gotten more questions about it, that
Yeah.
because it's such it's such an interesting story. And I actually wrote really top notch. I did an incredible amount of research for that very short section.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of like, it's like if you want to know anything about there, you've got everything you need in that short section to do a deep dive on the geese of the Crossbones Graveyard. Yeah.
Mm. That's
The
so interesting.
Winchester geese. Yeah, is what they're also called, the Winchester geese.
Yeah, that is a very interesting and cool
Yeah.
and
And
sad
I know.
story, but
I actually think I'm going to do a couple of Substacks highlighting some of those lesser known stories from becoming the
yeah,
pastor's wife. Just, my favorite things.
yeah.
So that may be one of them that I pull up.
We're coming to the end of our conversation, and I have two questions that I'm hoping to ask all of the guests that I have on, thinking kind of broadly about as the work that we're doing at the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism and curating kind of a space for the academic study of evangelicalism in conversation with the community and all of the work that's happening there. So I want to know, looking ahead, what is one pressing issue about evangelicalism that you hope scholars will take up, whether it's something that you're wanting to pursue, or something that you say, I don't want to look into that, but I think someone should. Like, what is an issue that you think?
Oh gosh, that's a really good. So one of the things that I really hope, and this is another sort of niche thing that I ran across with becoming the pastor's wife, and it was when I was in the Southern Baptist Archives and I asked for those clergy tax returns, and the archivist was like, nobody's ever looked at these, and I was like, I am convinced that there is a monetary link between the rise of a theology that says women can't be preachers and the economic benefits of
Mm,
being a pastor, which change in the 20th century at the same time the theology that pushes women out of the pastorate starts changing. And I'm not, and I was honest in the book. I'm like, I'm not exactly sure how these things fit together. But what I know is that it is becoming more economically advantageous to be a pastor at the same time that pastors start saying that women can't be in that role.
yeah,
And it just seems to me, so I really want somebody to chase that down and see how those things actually, this would bring together that economic history with this religious. And
yeah,
so, follow the money. That's what you always
yeah,
say, follow
yeah,
the money. And I want
yeah.
somebody to follow the money on the clergy tax benefit.
I guess my last question for you is what do you think we should be reading? If we're thinking
Oh,
about
yeah.
evangelicalism, what's something that you think we should be reading right now? Either, an old work or new work. What do
Yeah.
you think is essential for people trying to understand
Well, Jesus
evangelicalism?
and John Wayne is always essential,
Yeah.
with Kristen Dumais. I would say also what book, I don't know if as many people has read, but Lisa Weaver Schwartz wrote this really fantastic book called Stained Glass Ceiling,
Mm,
which is a comparison of women in the Methodist space, what that supports women in ministry, and the Southern Baptist space that does not support women in ministry.
mm,
And what she really uncovers is that the problem is not just complementarian theology. The problem is patriarchal structures embedded even in churches that support women in ministry that are not allowing women to advance and still are, and in some ways, are perpetuating, even in egalitarian spaces, are perpetuating these complementarian ideas. And so I think that's a really powerful book that she has written. I would say also very, very recent is The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. I
mm.
think that's a really great one. I'm about halfway through that. And I think that's somewhat traumatizing. It reminds you of all of the James Dobson stuff, Focus on the Family, but I think is also really important. Again, thinking in that pastor's wife idea, how do people follow this? The impact, it's by creating models that children either completely reject or perpetuate. And
Sure.
that's how this stuff gets taught and moves forward into the next generation.
Great recommendations. Thank you.
You're
Um,
welcome.
that's all I have. Thank you so much for joining
Oh,
me today and for
yeah.
chatting. It was such a treat to listen to your lecture and to be in conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun.
You can find the full recording of Beth Allison Barr's lecture and Q&A from the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism on our YouTube channel at the CSE-UCCS. To stay up to date on the events and programs of the center, follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Bluesky, X, LinkedIn, YouTube. Just search the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at UCCS and you'll find us. And of course, you can find more information about the center, upcoming events, and other information on our website, center.uccs.edu/CSE. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and with the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation.